Whilst colonialism is largely discussed in historical terms, the social and cultural impacts persist today, leading us to wonder whether the word has potentially taken on a new meaning in this modern age. Here to discuss these matters, we are thrilled and privileged to be joined today by a host of highly informed individuals. First, we are joined by Maria Fernanda Espinosa, Ecuadorian academic, politician and diplomat, and former president of the UN General Assembly, the first woman from Latin America and the Caribbean to hold this position. Ms. Espinosa is councillor at the World Future Panel and considered an expert on, amongst other matters, Indigenous people's rights. Tsitsi Dangarembga, Zimbabwean writer, filmmaker, public intellectual and cultural activist. Ms. Dangarembga's works illustrate the themes of colonial and post-colonial African countries, and her numerous accolades, not least her recent shortlisting for a Booker Prize, are indicative of her international acclaim. I welcome Dr. Farish Ahmad Noor, political scientist, historian and associate professor at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, a member of the United Nations Panel of Experts on Religion and Politics. Dr. Noor also conducts extensive research on South and Southeast Asian political dynamics and the region's 19th century colonial history. And our very own Bishnupriya Gupta, Professor of Economics here at the University of Warwick. With an impressive career in research, she has worked on industrial organisation in colonial India and produced work focusing on the great divergence of productivity and living standards between Europe and Asia. Finally, I'm delighted to introduce our chair, Neil Munshi, West Africa correspondent at the Financial Times, based in Lagos, responsible for reporting on economics, politics, security and culture in the region, who will now open the debate. Once again, don't forget to put in your questions for the panelists throughout the debate by using Slido. The link is in the chat. Neil, over to you.
Great, thanks so much. Welcome everyone. Welcome to our distinguished panelists. So we're going to start with opening remarks from each of our panelists, and then we'll have a discussion, and then we're going to open it up to questions, as Izzy mentioned. So please do send in your questions. Bishnu, could you start us off with your opening remarks?
Thank you, Neil, and thank you to all the student organizers of this event. It's a privilege to be part of this illustrious panel. So I want to start with raising the question, is there a moral critique of colonization or colonialism? Does that override any economic arguments we might have? So let me start with the economic arguments. One view is that the empire had beneficial effects through modernization. So that is trade, railways, education, etc. And this view comes from Niall Ferguson from his book, Britain Dominated the World. The alternative view comes from a very different perspective. It says that British rule destroyed the local economy and it built British prosperity based on exploitation. And an example of this work is by Shashi Tharoor, his book on the Inglorious Empire. So let me try to kind of unpack this a little bit. The extreme case of an adverse economic effect of colonization is from the countries in the new frontier. So that's the United States, Canada, Australia, and so on. It is here that we see the direct effect which decimated the local population. It built prosperity for the European settlers by taking over the land, but none of this prosperity was shared by the indigenous population. But for most countries, the effect of European colonization was more nuanced. So let me just say a little bit from my own work. In my own work, I tried to construct GDP per capita for India going back to 1600. So what we see is when the East India Company conquered Bengal and established a colonial rule in 1757, India was already poorer than she had been in 1600 under the Emperor Akbar. So there is a story of decline I don't want to go into the factors of it, but there was a story of decline already when the British came. However, during the British rule, there is no evidence that there was increasing prosperity. There is no evidence that short spurts of growth lasted for long periods of time. In fact, all the way up to 1947, Indian GDP per capita mostly grew at around 0% per year. And India was one of the poorest countries in the world in 1947. Now, let me just talk a little bit about the railways and education, which are the two things that are often flagged up. So the British did built a massive railway network in India. The purpose of it was to connect the ports to the economic centers, but it also had beneficial effect for the whole country simply by connecting places. So for example, food could be moved from areas of scarcity to areas of, from areas of prosperity to areas of scarcity. On education, it's interesting. So when we talk about education, several universities were built in the metropolitan city. The British did introduce English education, but at the time of independence, less than 20% of Indian population had primary education. To me, that is not a success story. So while we can discuss about the benefits of English education, it doesn't bring, it's impossible to say that British introduced a basis for a very good education system for all Indians. So let me just end by saying that, okay, even if we can say that colonization benefited the country that was colonized, can we still make a case that it was a good thing? I would try to argue. I would definitely argue that it did not, because there is a moral argument against it. People are everywhere. People have the right to self-determination, and nobody can conquer by force or whatever and say that they bring economic benefits. So the argument against colonization is a moral one to me, whatever its economic implications. I'm going to stop there.
Great. Thanks so much. I think later we should try to unpack where this myth comes from, that of the great benefits of colonialism and kind of what sustains it today. In the meantime, Tsitsi, could you offer your opening remarks now?
Yes, thank you, Neil. When I think about colonization and its legacy, I think about the sites in which colonization has acted. And we generally think about it as acting on the land. People came to expropriate the land from the people who lived there for their own financial benefit. And we do forget or tend not to emphasize that, in fact, before colonization was entrenched in Africa and in other parts of the British Empire and other empires, there had been the actual appropriation of people's bodies. So we have a trajectory of different kinds of expropriation and appropriation. And so it's important for me to remember that the site of colonization is not just on the land, not just in the structure of the nation state and the way power was distributed and privileged, but it was actually also in the site of people's bodies. And I think the Belgian Congo is a very good example of this, where those bodies did not function in a way that was appropriate for the colonizing force, then those bodies were actually dismembered. People's hands were cut off and things like that. But then what does the body represent? The body represents a person, a self. And so the question for me that is very important is that what else besides the land and the body was colonized? We see that all of the subjective systems that determine a person, were also colonized. The cosmology was colonized. The ancient cosmologies were expropriated and new ones were brought. Language was colonized. So modes of thinking were colonized. There is a whole metaphysical empire beyond the economic and the physical empires that we talk about. There is a metaphysical empire. And this metaphysical empire was actually constructed intentionally because of the knowledge that without independent thought, there can be no independent action. And so it's very important for me to trace the whole trajectory of colonization from land through the person to economic aspects of colonization, to those subjective systems that determine how people see themselves in the world, how they can construct their own being in the world. And I think that at that level of metaphysical colonization, subjective colonization, the battle has hardly begun. As a writer, I'm really happy when I see that we have increasing numbers of African writers writing their stories in different kinds of narratives, whether it's academic, whether it's fiction, short or long. But there are many other subjective systems of narrative. And in this day and age, film is definitely one of them, moving images. And there is still, I would say, 100% colonization still. Even when you look at the literary narrative that is being produced, that literary narrative is controlled by maybe 1.5 dozen publishing houses. And there are ways of thinking that are said to constitute literature, and other ways of thinking and expression that are said not to constitute literature. And so even there, even though there is more production, the production is still in the colonized model of narrative production. And in film, we're still at the level of the body itself. Can a Black body be represented in this way? And so for me, I would say that the legacy of colonization is ongoing. We have really not begun to dismantle it. It has just changed form. It has morphed into ways that are more acceptable and less obvious in the 21st century, but its work and its results and its expropriation continue.
Great, thank you so much. You know, there's a lot to unpack there. I think one thing we can discuss in a little bit is I interviewed the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o a few years ago, and he writes obviously a lot about decolonizing the mind. And one of the things that he had been sort of very adamant about for many years was African writers writing in their native languages and how that was important. But he said when I met him that over time he'd kind of shifted his view on that in order to reach more people, maybe African writers do need to write in English, but they still need to go through this process of decolonizing their minds in order to do that. But let's unpack that in a little bit. Farish, could you offer your opening remarks?
Thank you very much, Neil, and thank you very much to the other speakers as well. I'd like to actually follow up from what both Bishnupriya and Tsitsi have said, and my concern as a historian of Southeast Asia lies with what I call the imperial divorce, the way in which Asia in particular was basically divided into these neat geographical, geopolitical blocks, such as Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Asia, Central Asia. And here, I think very clearly, we can see the legacy of empire alive and well. fully alive and well and being reproduced in academia, yeah, crucially in domains such as political theory, political science, politics and governance, international relations, security studies, and what have you. And this for me is deeply upsetting for a number of reasons, but I want to focus on two in particular. Having said that, I'll start with a caveat. And under no circumstances, of course, am I, endorsing any kind of essentialist or essentialized understanding of a kind of perfect pre-colonial Asia. We all know this is not true. Asians were more than capable of killing each other long before the Europeans came. However, having said that, the kind of Asia that I'm talking about is the Asia that we find in the works of people like K.N. Chowdhury, where you have this fluid continuum of a polynuclear, multi-centered Asia, where there was a lot of movement, migration, the migration of ideas, cross-fertilization of ideas and cultures and what have you. Now, all of that basically comes to an end by the 19th century as a result of the treaties that were signed basically between the European colonial powers. Yeah, and we see this in the way in which today it's startling how we in Southeast Asia, I'm speaking now from Singapore, but in Southeast Asia we've forgotten our links with the Indian subcontinent. Whereas years ago, when I was based in Germany at the center I used to work with, we toyed with the idea of a seascape, where we saw the Indian Ocean as one part, one grand continuum within Asia itself. And a lot of that is missing. And that's missing, one, because of that colonial rupture, but crucially, and I think we need to discuss this, it's missing because of post-colonial history writing by post-colonial nationalist historians, because as a result of state capture, having gained independence, it was perhaps understandable that the first generation of Malaysian, Singaporean, Indonesian, Filipino, Indian, Pakistani historians would write their respective national histories. But as they wrote their national histories, that's the problem. The nation state becomes the dominant paradigm, and then all these connections are gone. And because these connections are gone, we often come across these instances of cultural contestation, contestations over borders or what have you, and we've completely cut ourselves off from that earlier alternative reality, which was reality. So the point about language that was raised earlier, Tsitsi's point about our vocabularies. I'll just point out that, for instance, in Southeast Asia, in the Malay language and in the Indonesian language, the word that we use for homeland is tanah air, which literally means land and sea. Land and sea. Seascape is part of who and what we are, because Southeast Asians are, maritime Southeast Asia, we are maritime communities. So we don't have this fixed sense of territoriality. Our territories are fluid and mobile. However, the predominance of the kind of Westphalian nation state model that has now become the operative norm in political theory and international relations across the world, including Southeast Asia, means that entire communities that live across borders, people like the Bajau Laut, for instance, who live at sea, people like the Hmong, who are caught between Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, people like the Dayaks, who cross the border between Malaysia and Indonesia. These communities now are placed in this very liminal position, and often then when they are studied, they are not studied through the lens of only anthropology or political economy or history, but they're also studied through the lens of security studies, because these are liminal communities. They don't conform to what a citizen ought to be in the post-colonial modern world. And I think for that reason, there's a lot of baggage, Neil, as you said, there's a lot of baggage that we need to unpack. But my personal concern is how, living as we do in the post-colonial present, Southeast Asia, like the rest of Asia, immediately got absorbed into the post-Second World War global capitalist order. And like it or not, unfortunately, our post-colonial states are built on the foundations of colonies. And colonies, remember, were never democracies. Yeah? And so we've inherited that. And we see that, I think, in the source of governance and praxis of governance that we see in many parts of Asia in particular, where, states are wary of their own populations, states are scared of their own populations, states constantly are on the lookout for, rebellion, uprisings or whatever. And that same colonial mentality is still there. It's alive and well in the way we manage our economies, the way we look at land and nature as commodity, and the way in which we understand ourselves as these, regions and blocks. I'll just end by saying that, even as a scholar myself, right, I have to work with concepts like Southeast Asia, but I always remind my students, Southeast Asians never saw themselves as southeast of anyone. Historically, in the past, we were never southeast of anyone. As far as we were concerned, we were the center of the world. So these coordinates have been hoisted upon us, and I think that's the lasting legacy of empire, which we are still stuck with until today. Even the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, has the word Southeast Asia in it. And it's not a concept that we Southeast Asians invented.
Thank you. Well, this idea of nation states, this idea of these difficult borders, the way these structures were sort of put onto colonized nations, I think it leads pretty nicely into what, Maria, I hope you'll talk about when it comes to what multilateral institutions, what role they play in this and sort of efforts to decolonize.
Well, thank you, Neil. And let me first allow to congratulate the organizers. This summit is just celebrating its 20th anniversary, and I was very pleasantly surprised that to discover that it was a fully student-run summit. And that's why I was so excited. But greetings to the excellent panelists. When I hear you, I cannot agree more with the approach of what are the sequels, what we are inheriting, from colonial times. And in Latin America, it's not much different, I have to say. And I think that we need to look at what the international community has done, the multilateral system, the UN, the role of the UN since 1945, at least, from an international law perspective, from what countries agree upon. And I think that the long struggle for emancipation of colonized peoples worldwide had indeed a turning point with the creation of the UN in 1945. And the charter of the UN, I think it's chapter 11, addressed specifically decolonization as an imperative for peace and for stability. And I think that this post-war multilateral architecture provided, the ideal forum for legitimizing and bringing together the multiple anti-colonial struggles around the world. And I wanted to bring a little bit of history here, but I think that we have to remember that the decolonization project could not have been achieved without the decisive role of the group of the G77 and China and the movement of non-aligned countries within the UN. So I think these two intergovernmental bodies established the political dialogue platform, the cooperation platform among the Global South, especially on their quest for political independence and self-determination, as well as their economic and financial independence, of course. And these two groups, which as president of the UN General Assembly, I continue to work with, the G77 and the non-aligned movement, voiced the demands of the Global South at the United Nations. It's still happening today, using the newly established instruments of international law, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And when I heard you speak, I said decolonization is not only an international law matter, it is fundamentally a human rights issue as well. We know intense diplomatic moves from G77 and the non-aligned gave birth to this declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples through a very specific General Assembly resolution already in 1960s, and the establishment of the special committee on the implementation of the declaration that I have been working as ambassador of my country very, very closely to. It's called the C24. And in 61, the proclamation of 4 consecutive development decades at the United Nations. From the 60s to the 90s, but you know, just to give it profile and put it on the agenda, but we know, as Professor Gupta very clearly stated, you know, the economic decolonization hasn't happened fully yet. So, but we have to acknowledge that one of the big successes of the UN, I would say, is that, you know, 80 former colonies have gained independence since 45, including the 11 trust territories that existed at the end of the World War II. So I think I would say that this is perhaps one of the greatest successes of the UN to this day. At the time, you know, 750 million people, meaning nearly a third of the world's population at the time, lived in territories that were dependent on colonial powers. But today, the job is not over yet. You know, the people under colonial rule count for 1.6 million people. You know, the decolonization project is not over yet, and it has started to stagnate because of different reasons. The last non-self-governing territory that gained independence was East Timor in 2002. There's still 17 non-self-governing territories in the list on the Special Decolonization Committee. But, you know, they're very landmark situations. We don't have the time to discuss, but perhaps during the conversation, the situation of Puerto Rico, the occupied Palestinian territories, for example. And I think that there are very concrete reasons why the decolonization agenda is not going forward. And I think that I would just put the headlines, sorry, it's 4 in the morning here. The first one is, of course, the evolution of the forms of colonial dominion deployed by the occupying powers. And the second is the unwillingness, and there are cases of that, of non-self-governing territories to proclaim their own self-determination. Both causes have a common element, of course, is what I would call the obsolescence of the mandate and working methods of the very Decolonization Committee at the UN. I won't go into the details. Perhaps we can discuss that later, the special situation of Puerto Rico, the Malvinas Island, the occupied Palestinian territories, the very particular case of New Zealand and the Tokelau islands in the South Pacific. They have had 2 consecutive referenda, and basically the majority of the people are saying, no, we want to continue to belong to New Zealand, even though New Zealand is saying, please, you know, you should have, you know, you should be independent and free. But of course, there are strong economic ties and other benefits linked to their colonial situation, I would say, you know. But basically, what I would close by saying, this is the formal international law multilateral approach. But perhaps here, coming from Latin America, I think one of the most striking sequels of colonialism is the situation of indigenous peoples in Latin America. You know, 60 million people in Latin America, they're victims of structural injustices, you know, but also an example of dignity, of creativity and resistance. And just let me close by a very recent example of the context of inequality, marginalization, racism. Has been the response to the COVID-19 pandemic in indigenous territories, especially, for example, in the Amazon region in Latin America, where COVID-19 related mortality came up to 4 and 5 times higher than in the rest of the population. And this is because little access to drinking water, non-existent health services to address prevention measures, treatment, etc. Indigenous peoples were denied access to COVID-19 tests, and other details that unfortunately we don't have at the time to share here. And I think that the current multiple crises that the world is facing because of COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, the loss of biodiversity, the armed conflicts, etc., are showing us that decolonization is still, a pending project. But I also think that the UN has made a very important contribution, and multilateralism should be, the means and the way also to foster a process of decolonization, which is not, as I heard, the speakers today loud and clear, it is not only about the international law approach, but it's a more, holistic approach to decolonize minds and culture and language. Even as we speak, I'm thinking, my English is very bad in this very early morning, but I see in the work we all do internationally, we have to speak English. Otherwise, you are completely marginalized. And it is multilingualism has, instead of being an asset and a source of wealth, has become a means of exclusion yet again. And English has become, the symbol of the neo-colonial way of communicating among us. So there is still a lot of work to do. I'm a convinced multilateralist, and I understand that the international community, the role of international law, and the pending work of the Decolonization Committee has to be retooled, rejuvenated according to the current circumstances and the 21st century. And thank you, and back to you, Neil.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks everyone for those opening remarks. I guess I want to kind of go from there and move back to what Bishnu was talking about with this moral critique of colonialism. And I think one of the reasons why the decolonization project generally it has stagnated is that there are a fair amount of people who believe in the moral case for colonialism, certainly in the economic case for colonialism. And I wonder, maybe Bishnu, you could start, where does this myth come from, and what perpetuates it today?
So I think initially there were enough academics who wrote about the positive effect of colonization. There are a whole bunch of imperial historians who saw this as a gift to the rest of the world. And as a response, India and other colonies, when they were still under British rule, felt there was a need to respond. And I completely support that response, which was always exaggerated. And it was part of the independence movement that, you are actually doing us a lot of harm and you need to get out. So that critique is absolutely legitimate. But I feel that decades after, we now need to be more realistic, because to me, there is no moral argument for it. So let's look at the economics of it. And then we can look at the data. We can look at quantitative evidence or qualitative evidence. You know, there are biases in all these indicators, but we can still make a case to what extent there was some good things and to what extent there was some, you know, things were really bad. And I think that's a narrative which, you know, is being told now, certainly by my colleagues and economic historians who are trying to look at numbers to say, when exactly did Europe move ahead of Asia or other parts of the world? What explains this? Let's have a conversation which is based on data. And I think having that moral dismissal of colonization or colonialism makes it easier to be objective with the data. So I have no hesitation that even if I found India benefited a lot from British rule, which is not the case, but even if it did, I have no hesitation to say it was our right to decide where we go. It was not up to you to come and conquer us and say where we should go. So, you know, this whole, the honors in Britain today, everything is about the British order of the British Empire, commander of the British Empire. Does that empire exist anymore? Shouldn't we all say this prize needs a new name? So, you know, to me, I think the idea of colonization of the mind is such an important aspect on both sides. The colonizers think they did something great. The people who were colonized think something was bad, but they're still influenced by it. And therefore, I think there is a need to have this conversation of how do we go to a more objective setup? Where do we kind of, you know, find our own identity? I just want to end by saying I read in this lockdown, one massive gain was that I read 3 books by Tsitsi. Before I was trying to read the Booker shortlisted book, I thought, let me go back to the older ones. And it was a revelation, and it is really about the colonization of the mind. And thank you for writing those books.
Well, that, I think, I mean, that's a perfect sort of segue. Tsitsi, then how do we start that process in earnest of decolonizing the mind? What are the first steps? I think you're muted.
Yes, thank you, Vishnu, and thank you for all your lovely remarks and interesting points that you've put across. Thank you, Neil. Before I go into that, I would just like to maybe respond to what you had asked Vishnu about where does this moral case come from? And it will segue into what you have just asked me about decolonization. Well, I think that the moral case comes from neocolonialization, because colonization was built on the premise that the native was savage, was incompetent, unsavable, unless saved by the colonizing master. And at independence, the prediction was that this savage person will revert to type after this civilizing influence has been removed. And because we have a system of neo-colonization, that means that resources do not flow into true liberatory actions and modes. That projection has become validated in many countries. And as a Zimbabwean, actually Zimbabwe is one of the typical examples of this, called the jewel of Africa, and had a functioning economy, educated individuals, has just deteriorated into an absolute disaster, a basket case, as people say. And I resisted agreeing with that, but now I have really seen that that is where we have come. Look at our last coup. Without the support of the British, the ambassador at that time was Miss Catriona Lang, that coup would not have taken place. 2017, I call it the last coup because people say that there were others, for example, in 2008, where Robert Mugabe actually admitted that Morgan Tsvangirai had won the presidential election. The army stepped in again to ensure that power remained with ZANU-PF. So that was not spoken about. And then 2017, the engagement of the army was more obvious. And indeed, the British government had been behind it. And when the British government is behind something and these elite pacts take place, it means that all of the political powers of the world have at least tacitly agreed that such a process may take place. So now what we have is power often centered in the hands of people who have taken it by force, often in Africa through armed struggle, and not only armed struggle, but through guerrilla armed struggle, where rules and lawfulness are really a very gray area. And so previous speakers have spoken about the legacy. I think it was Farish who spoke about the legacy of the kind of state, a cannibalistic, extorting state that the colonials established. We have developed into another version of that state through these guerrilla wars, which are absolutely brutalizing and dehumanizing. So then the question becomes, we have the colonial trauma itself of colonial occupation of our countries. On top of that, we have these so-called liberatory processes, these revolutions that were extremely violent and dehumanizing to the extent of the body, you know, dismembering the body, undoing cultural norms that had held communities together even through the colonial time. For example, burial rituals, where people are then told they cannot bury their dead, or they have to sing and dance and produce revolutionary music instead of the normal funeral. So there was a huge and complete undoing. And as much as the UN is working at the political level, we are not working at that subjective level, where those ways of being that lead to cohesion and lawfulness actually are created in the individual. This is why I am in the arts, and this is why I produce the kind of narrative that I do, which I want to be accessible to ordinary people in my writing and in the films that I have made a long time ago and would like to go back to making. It is because I understand that you have to speak to people who are the result of these two violent processes, even three, if we go back as far as slavery. I'm not saying that pre-Western slavery Africa was a utopia. Of course it wasn't. But people were developing their ways of dealing with the situations they encountered. And then we had the rupture that came from the interruption of colonization. And then we went into another kind of rupture in order to undo the rupture of colonization. When are we going to be thinking about cohesion, of bringing things back together? And this is why neo-colonization depends on the metaphysical empire. Even when you speak, you must speak in the language of the colonizer. You know, I once just looked up in a dictionary, and it won't be all dictionaries, but I just wanted to find out. I looked up the word enslaver. It did not exist. in that dictionary. So people can be enslaved, and it's almost like a natural state, because enslavement is not done by anybody, it's done by a master. And to be a master is to have power imputed to you. So until bodies like the UN begin to understand that the work of decolonization is not just political, where power can be put into the hands of a group of bloody ex-guerrillas. Decolonization means building the subject afresh to be able to participate and sustain the self and the community in the 21st century. In my opinion, we have not begun the discussion on decolonization.
I think, you know, if we can turn to Maria, maybe you can respond to sort of some of the points Tsitsi was making there. How can the UN move beyond the political? Yeah.
Well, when I was listening to Tsitsi and Professor Gupta, it just, you know, it was like a revelation, because I see that international politics and diplomacy is a constant struggle, you know, of negotiating decolonization in a way, you know, because when we discuss the climate crisis and the global South screams for climate justice, when we discuss about the extinction crisis and the disappearance of biodiversity as a major, you know, world asset. Biodiversity is physically, you know, located in the global South, and how the negotiation to stop the extinction is made, you know, in the everyday diplomatic work at the UN. You see that it does make sense when we negotiate on to fight the international division of labor, and in this construct of center periphery, you know, who is the center, who is the periphery, you know, the classical theory of dependence. This is the kind of daily life struggle in international politics. And I think that when we speak about decolonizing the minds, I think that we should also speak about decolonizing diplomacy and international politics. And it is about using the umbrella of the United Nations to continue with these struggles. And as we speak, one of the main, I think, examples of how you know, colonialism lands into our daily life is look at the access, distribution, and deployment of the COVID vaccine worldwide. You know, just think about that. And it is as if, you know, we were living colonial times, because, you know, I am here in a beautiful country, my husband's country, Nicaragua. We keep asking ourselves, when is that countries like my own, Ecuador or Nicaragua, are going to have access to the vaccine? Even, you know, with the COVAX facility and all of that. We already know that some countries have or bought in bilateral deals with the big pharmaceutical companies. They have already bought, you know, 5 vaccines per person in their very wealthy countries. And you are sitting in Zimbabwe, Tsitsi. I don't know if you're there, but, you know, when is that? You know, the African continent is going to be vaccinated. You know, just that shows us that there is something the moral critique that Professor Gupta was mentioning, and I think Farish as well, is about not a moral critique, but a moral imperative, you know, to really make visible, put these issues on the agenda. So it is not only, you know, what we have inherited from colonial rule, is our daily lives. If you look at the geography of poverty, if you look at the geography of racism, if you look at basic universal health coverage, who is left behind? And it is so obvious that the current geopolitics, it's a contemporary display of how, you know, a colonial rule still lives among us, you know, in a way. Just that leads me to even rethink, you know, the very concept of national states, how they play, the relationship between government and power. In having worked, you know, for government, you see, you know, what is democracy and the meaning of democracy, of liberal democracies. There was the 2020 Global Value Survey, and what it's telling us is, for example, that worldwide, you know, people trust 13% of people worldwide trust political parties. And the numbers are not higher when you talk about parliaments, when you talk about our political systems. So I think that there is something, you know, fundamental about our quest for decolonization, for true decolonization, that is decolonization of the minds, but decolonization of our political structures, you know, the negotiation of our own diversities, the role in my part of the world of indigenous peoples, these 60 million people that have suffered from COVID more than anyone else. And if we look at indigenous women, for example, I don't even want to go there in terms of domestic violence and other issues, but you know, I'm just inspired by listening to you and to say that there's a lot of homework that we need to do. And now that the phrase of the day is building back better, how to recover better from COVID, from the pandemic, which was, we have to acknowledge, a huge wake-up call, a stress test for humanity. And basically, I think it is clear that we cannot go back to the same old. If we have the slightest chance to make things better, you know, it has to have a lens of how to decolonize, you know, in a way, not only our minds, but our societies, our economies, and the way we interact with each other. And I will just give back the floor to you, Neil.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Before we get to the Q&A, I wanted to just talk about one more thing, which is, you know, what you panelists are describing are, you know, the profound negative impacts of colonialism and how we live with them today. In a way, we're talking about a debt that is owed, and a big question, Farish, around decolonization is this issue of reparations. What do these former colonialist countries owe their ex-colonies? Can you talk a little bit about how we think about reparations, how we should think about it?
Well, just to go back to the point raised by Maria earlier, I think one of the starkest instances we have of, you know, neo-colonialism being alive and well with us today is precisely this enormous crisis when it comes to the distribution of the COVID vaccine, right? And as Maria said, we have wealthy countries that have 500% more than they need, whereas, huge parts of Latin America, Africa, and Asia are going to lag behind by a couple of years before they even see the first vaccine arrive. Now, obviously, the only reason why these rich countries are in the position to accumulate this enormous surplus is because of the gains that they've made. So for me, it's clear cut. Yes, of course, we deal with the issue of corruption and abuse of power and gatekeeper states and patron-client links and what have you in many parts of the non-Western world. But these things are institutionalized and there are structures there, which, by the way, today we can actually point out. We can actually trace these things. Tsitsi earlier talked about, the sort of carnivorous, cannibalistic state that devours itself. All these elites that we see in so many parts of the non-Western world, the fact that they are actually serving as compradors in the same way that in the 18th and 19th century, there were compradors who worked with the East India Company, the Dutch East Indies Company, the French Compagnie des Indes. These compradors still exist. And today, by the way, it's not difficult to actually point out these links. Just look at where they keep their bank accounts. Simple as that. Simple as that, they're not keeping the money in their own countries. They're buying, chalets and mansions in places like Switzerland and what have you. So unless and until we actually address things like that and see the necessity for reparation, and I completely agree with Bishnu, this is a moral imperative. This is something we must demand. We will never get to that point of parity where we can even talk about, having an actual ethical, dialogue between North and South, East and West. It's not going to happen because it remains a dialogue of unequals, between unequals. But can I just go back slightly to Maria's point earlier about the need to decolonize things like international relations. Now, this, of course, has become a topic in academia, and I completely agree. I think if there's one domain, more so than history, sociology, anthropology, it's actually international relations that really needs decolonization. But we can't do this unless we give birth to another kind of southern subject. And this is why it's so important for academics like myself to work with people in the field of arts, literature, cultural production like Tsitsi, because we have, look at the state of academia in the non-Western world today. You have hundreds and thousands of universities popping up all over Asia, teaching things like political theory, international relations, or what have you. But here you have, Asian, African, Latin American professors who are only Asian, African, and Latin American by name only, as far as, the way they think and the way they see the economy, the way they see the global market, the way they see international relations. We've not moved from that Westphalian model, and that Westphalian model is the basis upon which colonial capitalism was later built upon. Remember, the Westphalia and the emergence of the East India Company and the Dutch East Indies Company, all of this happened in the same century. And so we are really looking at a particular type of colonization that began in the 17th century, not to be compared with the colonization of Spain and Portugal before that, which was missionary. But the colonization we are talking about now, the one that impacts on us now, is the colonization that was actually spearheaded by militarized colonial companies with the backing of their states. And how is that any different when we look at the geo-economic landscape of the world today? We have companies with private armies, buying up huge chunks of the non-Western world, buying oil and gas before it's even taken out of the earth. They already own it for the next 40, 50, 60 years. How is this any different? We're still living in the shadow of the 19th century as far as I'm concerned. And so this need to decolonize, and I completely agree with Tsitsi's point here, it's not simply, the people in general, but in particular, certain groups, academics, technocrats, diplomats, need to be able to understand that there are other alternative geographies and epistemologies and vocabularies that we can use when we talk about states, nations, regions, and what have you. And that has not happened, unfortunately. It's a long struggle, because the moment we mention the word decolonization, it's seen as something arty, it's seen as something cultural, and invariably it's relegated to domains like museums and stuff like that, which is not wrong, by the way, but it should not stop there. What I really want to see is the decolonization of the hard social sciences, political theory, politics, economics, international relation, international economics. And here's where we really need to work together. So I think, the contribution of people like Tsitsi is enormously important, because you can't have that unless you create a generation of people who are acutely aware of the nature of the problem, that this is a problem of mental colonization and mental bondage. And unless you understand that, then that urgency to look for other ways of thinking and speaking of the world is not going to be felt. So yes, Neil, then obviously, reparation is important, but in every aspect. It's not simply the wealth that was taken and stolen, but it's also the ideas, the geographies, the knowledges that were either marginalized or silenced or rendered exotic and quirky and stuff like that. Go to any bookshop in the West, and you look at, under philosophy, you have Aristotle, Socrates, Hegel, Kant, and then where do you find Ibn Khaldun? Where do you find Confucius? It comes under the subcategory of Asian philosophy, and I hate stuff like that. My own background is philosophy as well, and I just despise things like that. Ibn Khaldun is the founder of modern political sociology, and he should be right there next to Gramsci and Fanon, but he's not there because he's an Arab. And so, we've got to address this. Yeah, this is the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. I mean, not here, not in our room, but I'm talking about the other rooms out there.
I mean, amazingly, you have just answered, in a way, our first question from the Q&A. The most popular question was about this idea of metaphysical colonization and how important it is to change curriculums in schools and which authors and artists should be included. I don't know if anyone else wants to offer some thoughts on that as well. The next question is also, why native languages are not emphasized, as many of our panelists have brought up, in the decolonized nations, and instead, we continue to promote the language of the colonizer, regardless of where you are in the world. So those two questions are a bit connected. I don't know if anyone else wants to offer some thoughts on that.
Yes.
No, go ahead, Tsitsi.
Yeah. Thank you, Neil. Yes, the issue of language is really fundamental, because language is our putting into words of our subjective impressions of the world. So now we use English, and this is because of the rupture of the normal processes of development of language in the parts of the world that were colonized, where language would have developed. For example, in Africa, we have Kiswahili. And Kiswahili is a language that includes many aspects of the local languages spoken on the coast, a variety of them, and Arabic and a few other languages. But now it is a lingua franca in East Africa. And actually recently, South Africa has begun teaching Kiswahili in schools. That is a normal progression, where the intention is not to subjugate completely and extort completely. That is something that happened in a more holistic, organic manner. So where the colonial governments were actually established, speaking in one's own language was discouraged in so many ways, and it became an economic imperative as well, because you couldn't be employed unless you spoke the colonizer's language. So there were many reasons for that. The question then becomes, what happened to those local languages? People say, why are you not speaking your local language now? So imagine people came to my part of the world in the second half of the 19th century, and thought and development in the local language stopped at that point. We are now in the 21st century. We simply do not have the language with which to speak in 21st century concepts. All right, people will say, so how did other countries do that? For example, Japan and Germany, after they had ruptures and interruptions in their trajectories, they were still able to do that. And this is where intention comes into play, and the capacity for even forming that intention, the capacity for even thinking in the way that says, I would like to develop the local language of this place so that we can speak to each other in a language that also incorporates our whole subjective heritage. Now, most of the people who came into power in my part of the world have no concept, because what was available, you went to school to become a teacher, to become a doctor perhaps, and that was again to service the colonial state. So you could teach the colonial subject just enough to make them useful for the colonial state. So you could heal that colonial body so it could continue to produce for the colonial state. So the self, the colonial subject, was never at the center of thought or action or practice as a self. And so it is impossible to think that languages that were interrupted up to 2-3 centuries ago have developed in a way that enables them to embrace the concepts that are necessary. This is another level of that subjective development that I have been talking about. And that you mentioned earlier, Neil, that Ngugi wa Thiong'o used to say that people should write in their local languages. And recently he has decided that maybe that is not such a strict requirement so that one can reach more people. That is the point, because these languages have not developed. We do not have the concepts, even in translation. So it is almost impossible for somebody who wants to write in Shona to have a character who is a nuclear physicist in the United States. You simply cannot write that book because there are no words for that. To have the words, we need to invest in developing the languages. Where's the money going to come from? The UN will sit down with the government and will say, your needs are that you have so many people starving. We're going to give you money so that you can import yellow maize from the United States. So again, the farmers in the United States get paid. But nobody will listen to people like me who come up and say, look, we need money to put into these subjective enterprises. So what is actually happening? People are coming to Africa from the global north with money to colonize, recolonize those subjective areas again. Just tonight, I have a conversation with somebody who is doing exactly that. We don't think of it as colonization. The intention is not colonization, but at the end of the day, it is, because those systems that come in with that kind of wealth to create something are not emerging holistically from what is on the ground. I do not want to sound as though I am holding only people from the global north and the institutions of the global north at fault. We have wealthy Africans. Wealthy Africans are not investing in those systems either. They would prefer to invest in subjective systems of the global north. They are not interested in the subjectivity and the subjective systems of the areas where they came from in Africa. I know that India is different, and also Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia are different, but in Africa, that is the situation. I sometimes wonder whether it is because the source of their wealth is actually the global north, and if they start rocking the boat in that way, they may find themselves without wealth. So again, it's a political imperative to actually channel funds into that kind of development in these areas. Otherwise, we are trapped in the development aid framework. Even when it comes to reparations, I am concerned, because what is going to happen? Those multilateral organizations that are engaged will sit down and make some more elite pacts, and then they will bring the money into Harare, let's say, and tomorrow that money will be in Dubai.
Exactly.
So how are we going to depoliticize even our systems of implementation so that the resources actually do the work that they are expected to do, if they are expected to do it? Sometimes I have to think that perhaps these resources that are being channeled to Africa are not actually intended, because there are people like me, and I have such conversations with so many people like Ngugi. I wanted to do this, I wanted to do that, but you never have access to the resources that are required to do these things. So there must be a system there that is excluding people like me and my colleagues that I have spoken to from doing the things that they want to do, and enabling people like our leaders to deposit so-called development aid or whatever resources in Dubai. There must be enabling systems if it continues to happen.
Exactly. Yeah. Neil?
Yeah.
Can I just add a little bit on language to what Tsitsi said just now? I think there's also another aspect of language. As Maria noted, like it or not, unfortunately, English is the language of international finance, international relations, and what have you. But English is not a totalized language system. Yeah, it's porous. It has also, I mean, we have words like impasse, boulevard, ancien régime in the English language. It's in the English language. And I think here, when we look at Asian words that end up in the English language, I mean, what's the Malay word that ends up in the English language? It's amok, of all things, right? So when Asians or other language systems, make an impact in these European languages, their words related to, amok, violence, barbarism. I know sampan is another Malay word that ends up in the English language. But I think the struggle is twofold. It's to inject into that international language, because English is not the language of just the English anymore. It is the language of international relations. Here's where, in places like the UN, we need to inject, vocabularies like what I said earlier, the Southeast Asian understanding of homeland as land and sea, tanah air. I would love to see that being injected again and again and again and again at places like UN, so that you have another way of looking at territoriality. So while I completely agree with Tsitsi's point, and I think this is the dilemma and the challenge faced by those of us who are in the global South, there is still, I think, also that need to bring our concerns and debates and our vocabularies into that, discourse of power at the global level.
Well, just to add something, 2022, we will start with the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. I think it is an opportunity to bring this discussion internationally. UNESCO is pushing very hard because we have 7,000 languages, and one language disappears every 2 weeks worldwide. And if you come to understand why, it really hurts your heart to understand why. It's because the extinction of a language is the extinction of a culture. It is the extinction of the livelihoods of so many people in the global South, including indigenous peoples in Latin America. But perhaps, Neil, to very quickly say, just to call your attention on something in the Caribbean. The Caribbean is a very, very interesting region in our part of the world, and simply, to just call your attention to Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And he is pushing for an international campaign on reparatory justice, and slavery reparations, because you were asking, Neil, about reparations, and it has to do with transatlantic slave trade during colonial times. And he's bringing to the international agenda and International Court of Justice this idea of this Caribbean reparatory justice concept, which I think it's interesting. And it doesn't come from academia, it does come from the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And I think it's something, to look at and perhaps study how it unravels, because I find it extremely interesting. Back to you, Neil, and we have Izzy here.
Yeah, sorry, I'm so sorry. I hate to cut you off, but we will get cut off promptly at 15:15. It's such a shame, because I feel like you could honestly speak for hours on this. It's been such a pleasure listening to you all have such an engaged debate. It's been honestly a real privilege, and I thank you all so much for responding to our questions. We've had so much engagement from the audience, which clearly demonstrates how great you've all been and how pertinent a topic this really is. So thank you all very much.